The night the lake turned the wind into knives, a forgotten railway cabin flickered with a single light. A broken veteran and his retired K-9 stood inside, listening to the storm hunt for weakness. He had $10, a failing roof, and nowhere left to go. Then, footsteps in the snow. A cry swallowed by the wind. One decision would turn that light into a lifeline and a ruin into a refuge. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Duluth, Minnesota, did not ease people into winter, it forced them into it. By late November, Lake Superior had turned from water into a weapon, hurling wind through the city with a cold that cut clean and deep. Snow did not fall gently. It slid sideways, scraping skin raw, collecting in hard ridges along sidewalks and stairwells. The sky hung low and gray, heavy enough to feel like it might press the city flat. Streetlights burned dim and yellow against the storm, and the distant groan of freighters in the harbor carried across the frozen air like something alive and tired. Gideon, Gid Mercer, moved through that weather with practiced restraint. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad without excess, built like a man who had learned long ago how to carry weight without showing it. His face was sharp-edged, the jaw square and set, it with cheekbones that gave him a permanently guarded look. A thin scar traced his right temple, pale against weathered skin. His hair was cut short, dark brown streaked with early gray, and his beard came in evenly, trimmed close out of habit rather than care for appearance. His eyes were steady, alert, the kind that never stopped measuring distance or listening for changes in sound. He wore a faded green field jacket that still held its structure, black jeans stiff with cold, and boots scuffed but clean. Everything about him suggested discipline, held together by routine. At his side walked Rook. The dog was a German shepherd, sable-coated, black along the spine and muzzle with tan legs hardened by years of work. At 7 years old, Rook had not slowed. He had only grown more precise. His body stayed close to Gid's knee, a matching pace without a leash correction, his ears constantly adjusting to the environment. His amber eyes tracked movement without fixation, always returning to Gid as if to confirm position and intent. A faded service harness rested against his shoulders, the fabric worn smooth where hands had once gripped it in moments that demanded control. Rook did not wag his tail often. When he did, it was measured, almost formal. They stopped in front of a narrow house on the edge of Lincoln Park, a place that looked as if it had been tired long before winter arrived. The paint along the siding peeled in thin curls, and the porch sagged just enough to make each step complain. Warm light leaked through the front windows, but it felt thin, like something rationed. Gid wiped his boots on the mat before stepping inside. He did it automatically. 'Twas the way he did most things, without expectation of thanks. The smell inside was stale, reheated food, old beer, dust caught in carpet fibers. A television blared from the living room, laughter bursting out of it at regular intervals without meaning. The house belonged to Dale Mercer, Gid's cousin, a man in his late 30s whose life had narrowed into small irritations. Dale was thick around the middle, his posture slouched from years of sitting rather than working. His hairline had retreated, leaving him to comb what remained forward in quiet denial. He kept his beard short, not because it suited him, but because it was easier than caring. His eyes carried a permanent edge of annoyance, as if the world owed him comfort and kept failing to deliver it. "You're tracking snow everywhere," Dale said, eyes still on the television. Gid said nothing. He unzipped his jacket and held it rather than hanging it, already aware of how temporary his presence had become. Rook sat behind his left leg, silent and attentive, watching Dale with the same steady focus he used on strangers in unfamiliar territory. From the hallway came Tessa, Dale's girlfriend. She was tall and thin, her movements sharp, her blonde hair pulled into a loose knot that suggested impatience more than style. Her skin was pale, her face angular, and her eyes carried the flat appraisal of someone who had already decided what she thought. She crossed her arms when she saw Gid, her attention flicking briefly to Rook before settling somewhere past them both. Dale muted the television and turned, bracing himself with a sigh that sounded rehearsed. "This isn't working," he said. Gid felt the words land before he processed them. He had been expecting this, had felt it building in small ways, the silence when he entered a room, the way Tessa stopped making eye contact, the way Dale counted groceries. Gid had tried to compensate by becoming invisible. He cleaned without being asked. He fixed a loose hinge. He took Rook out before dawn so the dog wouldn't be a problem. He kept his nightmares to himself and his past sealed away. None of it had mattered. "We did what we could," Dale continued, rubbing his hands together as if warming them. "You've been here long enough." Gid opened his mouth, closed it again. He had learned when to speak and when words were just another way to bleed. Still, something forced itself through. "I can sleep in the garage," he said, "or the basement. I'll stay out of the way." Dale's jaw tightened. "No, that's not happening." He glanced toward the hallway, avoiding Gid's eyes. "You're a grown man. You'll figure it out." "Old enough?" The implication settled heavy and final. Gid nodded once. That was all the acknowledgement the moment would get. He packed quickly. There wasn't much to gather. Clothes folded with care, a blanket worn thin, a paperback with a photograph tucked deep inside, and a small envelope of cash that never seemed to change no matter how often he counted it. $10 and some loose change, enough to last a day or two if he was careful. Rook watched him pack, then pressed his shoulder lightly against Gid's leg when Gid's hand paused at the zipper. It was a grounding touch, brief and precise, the way the dog had been trained to interrupt spirals before they became dangerous. Back in the living room, Dale had already turned the television back up. Tessa stared at her phone. Neither offered help. Neither said goodbye. Gid opened the front door. Cold surged inside immediately, sharp and invasive. He stepped out onto the porch, clipped the leash to Rook's harness, and pulled his beanie down over his ears. The porch light clicked off behind him without hesitation. The door closed. The lock engaged. It was over. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he expected anyone to stop him, but because endings sometimes needed a second to register. Then he started walking. He didn't head toward the shelter or the VA office, not yet. Those places came with forms, fluorescent lights, and questions he wasn't ready to answer. He moved instead through neighborhoods already settled into warmth, past windows glowing with ordinary lives, kitchens, tables, hands passing mugs. The normalcy of it pressed against him harder than the cold. Rook moved easily beside him, paused silent on packed snow. A car passed too fast, spraying slush. Somewhere near the harbor, a train horn sounded low and long, a lonely note that carried across the frozen air. They stopped beneath an awning near a brick wall covered in flyers. The community bulletin board was layered with curling paper and faded ink, advertisements for odd jobs, church dinners, lost pets. Gid scanned it without urgency until one new sheet caught his attention. City surplus auction, sealed properties, minimum bids listed. He stepped closer. Snow collecting along the edges of the page. His eyes moved down the list, methodical, until they stopped. Railway watch cabin, decommissioned, unsafe, sealed, minimum bid, $10. Gid felt the envelope in his pocket. He didn't reach for it yet. He just stood there, reading the words again, letting the lake wind push against his back. Rook sat at his heel, looking up at him, waiting. For the first time since the porch light went out behind him, the tight pressure in Gid's chest shifted. It wasn't hope. It was something quieter and heavier, a decision beginning to take shape. He folded the edge of the paper down with his gloved thumb and stood there a moment longer, as if committing the words to memory. Then he straightened, adjusted the strap of his duffel, and turned away from the board. The wind followed him. He didn't slow down. Morning came without ceremony. Duluth did not announce daylight. It allowed it in reluctantly, a thin gray wash that flattened color and sharpened edges. Gideon Mercer woke on a wooden bench beneath the awning where he had stopped the night before, his back stiff, his jaw aching from holding tension through sleep. Rook lifted his head the instant Gid moved, breath fogging once, then settling again. The dog had slept lightly, body angled to block the wind, ears twitching at every distant sound. The bench was dusted with fresh snow, a fine crust that had formed while the city pretended to rest. Gid sat up and rolled his shoulders until the joints warmed enough to cooperate. He took stock the way he always did after a bad night. Fingers moved, toes responded. No sharp pain, no dizziness. He checked Rook's paws for ice cuts. I brushed the snow from the dog's coat, then stood. The envelope in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. $10 had no business carrying that kind of weight. He walked back toward the civic building where the auction would be held, keeping to side streets to avoid traffic. The city looked different in daylight, less forgiving. Warehouses along the rail spur loomed with rusted ladders and boarded windows. The lake wind cut straight through alleys and open lots, finding the seams of his jacket. Rook stayed close, posture neutral, the kind that said alert without invitation. The auction room was small and drafty, tucked into a municipal annex that smelled of old paper and floor cleaner. Folding chairs had been set in uneven rows. A handful of people stood rather than sat, farmers with wind-burned faces and heavy coats, a man in a high-visibility jacket who looked bored already, a woman with a clipboard who kept glancing at her watch. The atmosphere carried the quiet impatience of people there for practical reasons, not spectacle. At the front sat the clerk, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair cut blunt at the jaw. Her nameplate read, Marjorie Klein. She wore square glasses and a cardigan that had seen many winters. Her expression was professional, flat, but not unkind. She had learned long ago that auctions were about efficiency, not stories. Gid took a seat near the back wall where he could see the door. Rook lay at his feet without instruction, head on paws, eyes open. A few people glanced over, assessed the dog, then looked away. No one challenged the presence. Duluth knew working animals when it saw them. Items went quickly. New scrap lots, decommissioned equipment, a parcel of land no one wanted because it flooded every spring. Bids were sparse and utilitarian. When the railway watch cabin came up, the room shifted in a subtle way. Less interest, more discomfort. Marjorie cleared her throat. Railway watch cabin, she said, reading from the list. Decommissioned, unsafe, city sealed, minimum bid $10. Silence followed. Someone coughed. A man in the front row smirked faintly, the way people did when they recognized a bad idea and enjoyed not being the one attached to it. Gid raised his hand. Marjorie paused, eyes lifting over her glasses. She took him in quickly. The jacket, the dog, the way he sat straight without rigidity. $10, she said, not a question. Yes, Gid replied. His voice carried without effort. Marjorie glanced around the room. Any other bids? The pause was brief, almost perfunctory. No one spoke. Sold. The gavel came down with a sound that was final without being dramatic. Gid stood, signed where he was told to sign, his handwriting clean and deliberate. Marjorie slid a folded document across the table. You'll need to contact the city inspector before occupying, she said. It's sealed for a reason. I understand, Gid said. She studied him a second longer than necessary, then nodded once. Stay warm. Outside, the wind had picked up. Gid tucked the paper into his jacket, feeling the strange, fragile solidity of it. Ownership was an odd word for something that might collapse under its own weight, but it mattered all the same. He didn't linger. He turned toward the rail spur and started walking. The watch cabin sat a mile beyond the last maintained road, where the tracks curved away from the harbor and into scrubland that had never decided what it wanted to be. Snow lay unevenly across the ground, drifted into troughs by the wind. The cabin revealed itself slowly, a low structure hunched against the open land, its roofline sagging, boards dark with age and weather. Yellow warning tape fluttered weakly from a post, the city seal sign bolted crookedly to the door. Up close, the damage was honest. Rot along the lower boards. A corner of the roof collapsed inward, leaving a jagged gap, windows broken out, edges frosted. The door leaned on one hinge, swollen and split. The place smelled like old smoke and wet wood, a scent that suggested history more than decay. Gid circled the structure, testing boards with the heel of his boot. Owa noting where the frame still rang solid under pressure. He crouched to peer under the eaves, measured the angle of the sag with his eye. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't flinch either. Rook paced the perimeter with him, nose low, cataloging scents. Old oil, rust, animals that had passed through but not stayed. The seal came off with a pry bar borrowed from the debris pile behind the cabin. The door complained but opened. Cold rushed out as if the building exhaled. Inside, the space was smaller than it looked. One main room, a narrow back alcove that might once have held a desk and a stove. The floor dipped near the center where water had eaten away at the supports. Light filtered through the roof gap, catching dust motes and turning them briefly bright. Gid stepped in. Wait careful. He stood still and listened. The wind threaded through the walls, but the structure held. He set his duffel down and exhaled, slow and controlled. Rook entered last, nose working, then sat facing the door as if this were already a position to be held. By late afternoon, Gid had cleared a space near the back wall where the floor felt strongest. He dragged out rotted boards, stacked salvageable pieces, swept debris with a broken plank. His hands numbed and warmed and numbed again. He worked until the light thinned to blue. A truck slowed on the dirt road. Gid straightened, shoulders squaring by instinct. The driver leaned out, a man in his 60s with a weathered face and a beard gone mostly white, cut short and neat. His name was Warren Pike, though Gid wouldn't learn it yet. He wore a heavy canvas coat stained with oil, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Oh, that your place now?" the man asked, voice rough but not hostile. "For the moment," Gid said. The man grunted. "That cabin's tried to kill a few people. Cold does that." His gaze flicked to Rook. "Dog looks like he knows his job." "He does," Gid said. The man nodded once. "Hardware store's 2 miles back. Closes at 6. Scrap pile out back. Take what you can carry, don't steal." He paused, then added, "Name's Warren." "Gideon," Gid replied. Warren tipped his chin and drove on. Night fell fast. Gid wedged the door as best he could, spread his jacket over the driest patch of floor, and sat with his back against the wall. Rook lay across his boots, a solid, living weight. The wind tested the cabin, found gaps, whistled through them. Gid closed his eyes and pictured the work ahead, what could be braced, what had to come down, and how to keep the snow from settling where it would break things. Outside, the tracks hummed faintly as a distant train passed, a vibration felt more than heard. Gid opened his eyes and looked at the folded paper in his hands, his name printed there in ink that did not care about weather or doubt. For the first time in weeks, he did not feel like he was waiting to be told to leave. The first real test came before dawn. The temperature dropped hard overnight, the kind of sudden plunge that turned breath brittle and made wood contract with sharp, complaining cracks. Gideon Mercer woke with the instinctive certainty that something had shifted. He didn't sit up right away. He listened. The cabin spoke in small sounds, the whisper of wind threading through seams, the dull pop of a board adjusting, the far-off rumble of a train moving along the lake line. Rook lay stretched across Gid's boots, head up now, ears forward, reading the same signals. When the dog's posture changed from alert to steady, Gid exhaled and pushed himself upright. Light crept in through the roof gap in a thin, bluish blade. Frost glittered along the inside of the boards like powdered glass. Gid rolled his shoulders, testing stiffness, and then stood and stamped warmth back into his feet. The night had not broken the structure, but it had made the weaknesses obvious. He moved with purpose, marking spots in his head, the door that leaked too much air, the sagging beam near the center, the corner where rot had crept far enough to threaten the floor. He didn't curse. He didn't rush. He simply cataloged. Outside, the land was locked in white. Snow had drifted into the lee of the cabin, piled knee-high against the west wall. Gid shoveled a narrow path with a broken board, clearing the base of the structure to keep moisture from eating deeper. Rook patrolled the perimeter, nose down, tail low, circling wider than before. At one point, the dog paused and stared toward the scrub beyond the tracks, hackles lifting slightly. Gid followed the line of his gaze and caught movement. Nothing dramatic, just a shape slipping between brush. Probably a deer, maybe a fox. Duluth's outskirts were shared territory. Gid nodded once. Rook relaxed. By mid-morning, hunger announced itself with a dull insistence. Gid rationed carefully, splitting a protein bar in half, sharing a piece with Rook. He drank melted snow, warmed just enough over a small alcohol stove to take the edge off. It wasn't comfort. It was fuel. The walk back to town took longer with the wind in his face. Gid kept his head down, shoulders squared. At Warren Pike's hardware store, the bell over the door jingled thin and tired. The place smelled like oil, sawdust, and cold iron. Warren stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up over thick forearms mapped with old scars. His beard, white and coarse. He framed a mouth that rarely smiled. Years of trade had etched patience into his movements and suspicion into his eyes. "You look like hell," Warren said without preamble. Gid nodded. "Working on it." Warren snorted and jerked his chin toward the back door. "Scrap pile's still there. Take boards, nails, whatever's bent enough, I won't miss it." He paused, then added, "Don't take the good hinges." "I won't," Gid said. A younger man stood near the paint counter, thin and restless, tapping his foot. His name was Eli Barron, mid-20s, clean-shaven with hair cut too often to hide uncertainty. He wore a delivery jacket with the collar turned up and kept glancing at Rook with open curiosity. "That dog yours?" Eli asked. "Yes." "Police?" "Used to be." Eli nodded, impressed. "Figures. He looks like he knows things." Rook flicked an ear but didn't look at him. Gid loaded what he could carry. Warped planks, a coffee can of bent nails, a roll of tar paper with a tear down one side. Warren watched without comment, then slid a pair of work gloves across the counter. "Cold'll split your hands," he said. "Don't bleed on my scrap." Back at the cabin, the afternoon turned into labor. Gid braced the sagging beam with a temporary post cut from salvaged timber, taking careful measurements with nothing but his eye and a length of twine. He tore out sections of wrought, replaced them with sistered boards, hammered until his arms burned and his fingers went numb. Rook stayed close, shifting positions to keep watch, occasionally nudging a tool back into reach when it skidded across the floor. It was an old habit from training days: retrieve, assist, stay useful. Late in the day, a woman approached along the tracks, boots crunching in snow. Gid straightened, wary but calm. She stopped a respectful distance away, hands visible. She was in her early 30s, medium height, wrapped in a wool coat that had seen better years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, strands escaping to frame a pale face marked by winter redness. Her eyes were observant rather than intrusive. "I'm not here to bother you," she said. Her voice was steady, librarian soft. "Name's Maris Crowley." Gid waited. "I work at the West Duluth branch," she continued. "We keep an eye on the surplus notices. People talk." She glanced at the cabin, then at the tools in Gid's hands. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't freezing to death." "Not today," Gid said. Maris nodded. "There are warming hours at the library, no questions asked." She hesitated, then added, "And there's a bulletin board inside. If you need odd work, sometimes people leave notes." "I'll remember," Gid said. She looked at Rook, a faint smile touching her mouth. "He's beautiful." Rook met her gaze briefly, then looked away. Maris took that as permission enough. "Stay safe," she said, and turned back toward town. Night came early again. Gid worked until he could no longer feel the hammer through his gloves. He fed a small fire in a makeshift ring outside, careful to keep sparks away from the structure, then banked it low. Inside, the cabin felt different, not warm, but less hostile. The drafts had narrowed. The floor no longer shifted under his weight. As he settled against the wall, exhaustion crept in heavy and honest. He closed his eyes and saw the line he had drawn that morning, not on the ground, but in himself. This was the place he would hold, not because it was easy, because it was his. Sometime after midnight, the wind rose again. It pressed hard against the west wall, testing the bracing. The cabin groaned, then held. Gid sat up, heart steady, listening until the sounds evened out. He reached down and rested a hand on Rook's shoulder. The dog leaned into the touch, solid and warm. By morning, snow had fallen again, lighter this time, sifting through the air like ash. Gid stepped outside and looked at the cabin, at the small changes that had already begun to accumulate. It still looked rough, it still looked temporary, but it stood. He turned toward the path he had cleared and picked up his tools. There was more to do. He was not leaving. The storm arrived without spectacle, which was how the worst ones usually came. The wind shifted sometime after midnight, turning sharper, more deliberate, as if it had chosen a direction and intended to keep it. Gideon Mercer woke to the sound of something tearing, fabric first, then wood, a quick, ugly rip followed by the clatter of loose boards slapping against the frame. He was on his feet before the sound finished echoing, heart steady, movements clean. Rook rose with him, already facing the roof gap, hackles half lifted, body angled to brace. Snow blew straight through the opening, needling Gid's face and dusting the floor white in seconds. He grabbed the lantern, swung it up, and saw the problem immediately. The temporary tarp he had stretched over the sagging section had torn free along one edge, flapping like a flag. The bracing beam held, but the angle was wrong. The wind had found leverage. "Easy," Gid murmured, not to calm the dog, but to keep his own breathing measured. He pulled on his jacket, snapped the hood tight, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit hard enough to make his eyes water. Snow stung his cheeks and collected in his beard, instantly wet and heavy. He climbed carefully, testing each foothold, hands numb almost immediately. The roof complained under his weight, a low groan that traveled through the structure. Gid worked fast but not frantic, tying off the torn edge with twine, reinforcing it with a strip of salvaged board, driving bent nails home until his shoulders burned. Rook paced below, tracking every movement, ready to sound off if the structure shifted too far. When Gid finally climbed down, the tarp held. It wasn't elegant. It wouldn't last forever. But it would last the night. He shut the door against the wind and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood, breath fogging the air inside. The cabin still shook, but it no longer felt like it was coming apart. Morning revealed the cost. The roof sagged lower than before. The patched section darkened with moisture. Gid stood outside, hands on hips, assessing. He didn't let himself think in terms of failure. He thought in terms of sequence. What had to come down before something better could go up? Demolition was not destruction. It was preparation. He set to work at first light. The sound of prying wood carried across the scrubland, sharp and rhythmic. He dismantled the worst of the rotten section, piece by piece, lowering boards rather than letting them fall. Snow collected in his hair, melted, froze again. His gloves stiffened. He kept going. By midday, a truck appeared on the dirt road, tires crunching over packed snow. It stopped short of the cabin. The driver stepped out, a tall man with a narrow frame and a posture that suggested old injuries. His face was long and angular, skin weathered to the color of old leather. A gray beard framed his mouth, thick and untrimmed, and his eyes held a guarded sharpness. He wore a battered parka and carried himself like someone used to watching the horizon. "Name's Tom Halverson," he called, keeping his distance. "I run traps up by the creek. Been watching you tear that thing apart." Gid set his pry bar down. "It needed it." Tom grunted, approval hidden in the sound. "Most folks don't know the difference." He glanced at Rook. "Dog's got good sense." "He's earned it," Gid said. Tom nodded once. "Wind's gonna keep testing you. West side's the worst." He shifted his weight, favoring one leg. "I got some corrugated tin from an old shed. Not pretty, but it sheds snow. I'll trade you for help clearing a line after the storm." "That works," Gid said. Tom's mouth twitched, almost a smile. He climbed back into his truck and drove off without another word. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. A horse appeared along the track, slow and steady, led by a woman bundled in layers. The horse was a compact bay gelding, older, with a grizzled muzzle and patient eyes. His tack was worn but clean, movements careful on the snow. The woman was in her late 40s, broad-shouldered and strong-backed, her dark hair streaked with gray and tucked under a knit cap. Her name was Ruth Calder, though she didn't offer it right away. "I heard hammering," she said. Her voice was low, practical. "Figured someone was either fixing something or making it worse." "Trying for the first," Gid replied. Ruth studied the cabin, then him. "You're the vet." Gid didn't correct her. "Yes." She nodded. "My barn roof collapsed last winter. Took me months to fix. People don't realize snow's heavier when it's wet." She patted the horse's neck. "This is Jasper. He doesn't like wind." Jasper flicked an ear, as if to confirm the statement. Ruth reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a thermos. "Coffee. It's hot. Don't argue." Gid accepted it without ceremony. The heat burned his hands through the metal, a clean pain. He took a careful sip. It tasted like something solid. "Town's talking," Ruth said, not unkindly. "Some think you're stubborn. Some think you're reckless. I think you're working." Gid nodded. "Working keeps things simple." She mounted again, reins loose. "If you need straw for insulation, I've got bales I can spare. Not free. Trade." She tipped her cap and rode on, Jasper stepping carefully through the drifts. By evening, Gid had cleared the compromised section entirely. The cabin looked worse from the outside, more exposed, more honest. Inside, the space felt cleaner, less dangerous. He stacked salvageable boards, measured spans, planned the pitch of a new roofline in his head. Rook lay near the door, eyes half closed, conserving energy. As darkness fell, headlights appeared again. This time, it was Warren Pike's truck. He got out slowly, surveyed the damage, and let out a low whistle. "Well, you finally decided to stop lying to yourself," Warren said. Gid wiped his hands on his jeans. "It wasn't going to hold." "No," Warren agreed. He opened the truck bed and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. "Tar paper, nails, not new. Good enough." He set it down and met Gid's eyes. "Didn't say it was a gift." "I'll pay you back," Gid said. Warren shrugged. "Pay me by staying alive." The night settled in quiet and cold. Gid banked the fire low, sealed the door, and sat with his back against the wall, thermos beside him, tools laid out within reach. The cabin no longer shook the same way. It creaked, argued, adjusted. It was learning the way he was. When he finally slept, it was deep and unbroken. The roof above him was incomplete, but it was honest. And for now, that was enough. The temperature dropped again, but this time it did not surprise Gideon Mercer. Winter had a rhythm, and he was beginning to hear it. The cabin, stripped of its weakest lies, answered the cold with a different voice now. Less panic, more resistance. It still creaked, it still argued, but it no longer threatened to give up without a fight. Gid rose before dawn, shoulders stiff, fingers aching with the clean pain of work well done. He lit the lantern and hung it near the front window opening, the flame steady and deliberate, then stepped outside to check the roofline he had marked in his head the night before. Tom Halverson arrived mid-morning in his battered truck, corrugated tin rattling in the bed like loose coins. He parked where the wind would have less leverage and climbed out with the careful economy of a man whose joints remembered injuries better than dates. Tom's beard was rimed with frost. His eyes were sharp and unsentimental. He didn't ask questions. He unloaded sheets of tin and leaned them against the cabin, then nodded toward the creek line. "You clear that drifted run. I'll show you how to seat the tin so it sheds," he said. It wasn't instruction. It was collaboration. They worked without hurry. Gid shoveled and broke crust where snow had hardened like stone, his breath a measured cadence. Rook moved between them, alert but calm, pausing to sniff the air whenever the wind shifted. When Tom demonstrated how to overlap the metal just enough to keep meltwater from finding seams, Gid watched closely, memorized the angle. Here's then repeated it until his hands learned the motion. The roofline rose incrementally, a patient geometry. By afternoon, the cabin wore a new crown, uneven, utilitarian, but honest. Snow slid instead of settled. That mattered. Ruth Calder came by with straw bales in the back of a flatbed, Jasper plodding behind the truck like a shadow that had chosen its owner. She hopped down, boots crunching, and surveyed the work with an approving tilt of her head. Ruth's face was weathered and open, the kind that made no pretense of softness. She spoke plainly because plain speech had kept her alive. "Pack the straw along the north wall and under the floor where you can," she said. "Cold comes from the ground first." She didn't wait for thanks. She helped Gid wrestle bales into place, then swung back up onto the truck. Jasper flicked an ear at Rook, and then looked away, uninterested in drama. By dusk, the light thinned to iron blue. Gid banked the fire outside, sealed what he could inside, and stepped back to look at the cabin. It still looked temporary. It still looked like something a stiff wind could test. But the changes added up. He set the lantern back in the window opening and left it there as darkness took hold. The flame cut a clean shape through the snow. He was inside, laying tar paper along the interior seams when Rook stiffened. The dog's head came up, ears forward, body angled toward the door. Gid froze, listening. At first he heard only the wind, then, faint and broken, a sound threaded through it. Voices, not close, not steady, lost. Gid opened the door and the cold rushed in hard enough to steal breath. He stepped out, lantern in hand. I was scanning the scrub beyond the tracks. The light reached farther than it had any right to, catching movement. A shape stumbled, then another. He lifted the lantern higher and called out, voice firm. "Here!" They emerged from the snow like figures pulled from water. The man came first, tall and thin, his parka soaked and dark with melt. He had a narrow face, sharp nose, and a beard that grew in uneven patches, the kind that suggested youth more than neglect. His eyes were wide, unfocused, fear riding them hard. Behind him was a woman clutching a child to her chest. She was small, bundled deep, her hair plastered to her cheeks with ice. The child's hat was gone. The child's stillness was wrong. "We didn't see the turn," the man said, words tumbling. "The truck stuck. She's cold." Gid did not ask for names. He did not ask how long. He waved them forward. "Inside. Now." Rook stepped back to make room, then circled, positioning himself near the door. Inside, the cabin filled with breath and snow and the sharp smell of panic. The woman sank to her knees, shaking. The child, no more than 3, was frighteningly quiet. Gid knelt, hands already moving, peeling wet layers, checking skin, keeping his voice level. "Slow," he said. "Not too close to the heat. We warm from the center." The man hovered, helpless, hands clenched and useless. Gid handed him a blanket. "Wrap, hold, don't rub." He glanced at Rook. "Stay." The dog stayed, eyes on the door, ears tracking the wind, a silent guard. Minutes stretched. Gid warmed water, fed it carefully. He pressed heat where it mattered, spoke calmly, steadily, as if this were any other problem with a sequence that could be followed to an end. The child shuddered, then cried. A thin, broken sound that cut through the room like light. The woman sobbed into the blanket. The man sagged against the wall, relief making him weak. They stayed. There was no discussion. Outside, the wind rose and fell, angry at being denied. Inside, the lantern burned low but true. Gid sat back on his heels, hands shaking now that there was space for it. He did not look at the flame. He listened to breathing until it steadied. Near dawn, the storm eased. Silence settled, earned and deep. Gid stood and added a piece of wood to the fire, careful not to wake them. The man stirred anyway, eyes clearing. "I'm Caleb," he whispered. "This is Lila, our daughter, Mara." Gid nodded. "She's warm. She'll be tired." Caleb swallowed hard. We followed the light. Gid looked at the lantern in the window opening, the glass fogged, the flame unwavering. He said nothing. They left late the next day, after the wind had softened and the tracks were visible again. Lila hugged Gid without asking. Caleb shook his hand and held it longer than necessary, gratitude plain and unguarded. Gid watched them go until the scrub swallowed them. That evening, he reset the lantern in the window and left it there. He did not tell himself it was for emergencies. He did not tell himself it was temporary. He simply accepted what the cabin had become capable of. The night fell quiet. Snow whispered against the tin roof and slid away. The cabin held. The change did not arrive as applause. It came the way most real changes did in small towns, sideways, half-spoken, carried on boots and breath. The morning after Caleb, Lila, and Mara left, Gideon Mercer woke to a silence that felt different, not emptier, attentive. The wind had eased overnight, and the snow lay smooth and unbroken beyond the tracks, a clean white that made distances deceptive. The tin roof shed what little fell, the sound, a soft, disciplined whisper. Gid sat up, joints stiff, and waited a moment before moving. Rook was already awake, chin on his paws, eyes open and calm, as if he had been listening to the same quiet and decided it was safe. Gid fed the fire and checked the seams, hands moving from habit more than worry. The cabin held. He stepped outside and scanned the land. The lantern still burning in the window behind him. He hadn't meant to leave it on through the day. He noticed it then and considered taking it down. He didn't. He turned back inside and let the light keep doing what it had done. By mid-morning, tracks appeared near the path he'd cleared. Boots, not animals. A man approached from the town side, walking carefully, as if unsure of the welcome. He was stocky, late 40s, with a face that had softened around the eyes without losing its lines. His beard was dark and full, neatly kept, and his hair was cut short in the practical way of someone who didn't spend time in mirrors. He wore a city maintenance jacket faded from years of salt and weather. His name was Dean Hollis, though he didn't offer it right away. "You the one with the light?" he asked, stopping a few yards short. Gid nodded. "Depends who's asking." Dean smiled faintly, a crease deepening near his mouth. "Name's Dean. City maintenance. I plow the west spur when it's bad. He glanced at the cabin, then at the roof. Heard you pulled a kid back from the edge last night. Gid shifted his weight. She did the hard part. Dean shook his head. People like stories simple. This one's not. He cleared his throat. Council's going to hear about it. Not today, but soon. I'm not running a shelter, Gid said. I know, Dean replied. I told them that. I said you're a man with a lamp who didn't turn it off. He paused. That matters. Dean didn't stay long. He tipped his cap and walked back toward town, leaving tracks that the wind would erase by afternoon. The erasing didn't stop the movement. By noon, a pickup rolled in, slow and cautious. A woman stepped out, bundled in a down coat too big for her frame. She was in her early 60s, hair silver and cut in a blunt bob that framed a face made sharp by years of making decisions without permission. Her name was Ellen Price. She owned the diner near the harbor and had survived 2 winters without power that had taught her the difference between charity and usefulness. I'm not here to gawk, Ellen said. I brought soup. She held up a metal pot wrapped in towels. And bread. You can say no. Gid didn't. He accepted the pot and set it inside, the steam fogging the air. Ellen took in the cabin with a practiced eye, what was missing, what was working, what could fail. People get lost out here when the weather turns, she said. They always have. She glanced at the lantern. Leaving that on was smart. Rook watched her from the corner, the ears neutral. Ellen noticed and smiled. Good dog, she said, without reaching. In the afternoon, Maris Crowley returned, this time with a canvas tote slung over her shoulder. She looked colder than she wanted to admit, her braid tighter, cheeks flushed. She set the tote down and opened it to reveal batteries, wool socks, and a first aid kit with clean edges. I didn't bring a lecture, she said quickly, just supplies and a sign. She held up a small weatherproof placard with neat black letters, light on, shelter when needed. Gid stared at it longer than was polite. I didn't ask for that. I know, Maris said. You don't ask. She met his eyes. You can hang it or not. I won't tell anyone either way. He hung it by the door, the screws biting cleanly into the wood. The sign sat straight. That mattered too. The next few days settled into a pattern that surprised him by its steadiness. He worked in the mornings, reinforcing, sealing, learning the cabin's moods. In the afternoons, he walked into town for odd jobs that now seemed to find him. A loose railing, a shed door that wouldn't close. People paid in what they had, cash sometimes, food often, materials when they could. No one made a speech, no one lingered. Rook became a known quantity. Children who passed at a distance waved, then crept closer day by day. Rook allowed it, standing still, eyes softening just enough. Gid noticed the way the dog's tail moved more often now, not wagging, but acknowledging. Work changed the dog too. It gave him purpose without command. One evening, as dusk thickened, a snowmobile appeared at the edge of the clearing, engine sputtering. The rider dismounted awkwardly, a young man, maybe 19, with a narrow face and a fuzz of beard that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. His name was Lucas Morrow. He had tried to cut across the flats and misjudged the light. Didn't think anyone was out here, Lucas said, breathless. Gid handed him a mug of soup and pointed to the bench by the wall. Sit. Warm first. Then we'll talk. Lucas's eyes kept drifting to the lantern, then to the sign. My dad said there was a light. That night passed without drama. The snowmobile started after a few adjustments, and Lucas left with shaking hands and a promise to stick to marked paths. Gid watched the taillight fade and felt the weight of something settle on his shoulders. Not obligation, responsibility. 2 days later, the council inspector came, not with sirens or tape, but in a city sedan that idled politely. Her name was Paula Reyes, mid-40s, hair pulled into a severe bun, face composed to the point of unreadability. She wore a wool coat and carried a clipboard. Her eyes were dark and precise. I'm here to assess risk, she said, not intent. Gid walked her through the cabin, pointing out what he'd reinforced and what still needed work. He did not exaggerate. He did not minimize. Paula took notes, asked measured questions, and listened to the answers. This isn't compliant, she said finally. I know, Gid replied. She looked at the lantern, the sign, the supplies stacked neatly by the wall. It's also not nothing. She closed her clipboard. I'll file for a temporary tolerance, seasonal, volunteer use only. She paused. Don't make me regret it. I won't, Gid said. When she left, snow began again, light and patient. Gid lit the lantern as dusk fell, the flame catching and holding. He stood in the doorway a moment, listening to the cabin breathe, to the wind test and move on. He did not think about what the place was becoming. He thought about what it needed to be tonight. That was enough. Winter tightened its grip not with drama, but with persistence. The days shortened until light felt rationed, and the nights pressed in like a held breath. Gideon Mercer learned the difference between cold that challenged and cold that punished. He adjusted accordingly. The cabin had become less of a project and more of a system. Checks at dawn, maintenance before dusk, heat managed like a finite resource rather than a comfort. Rook mirrored the routine, rising when Gid rose, pacing when the wind shifted, settling only when the structure's sounds returned to the familiar language of stress rather than threat. The first heavy snow after the inspector's visit arrived in thick, wet sheets. Gid cleared the roof twice before noon, shoveling carefully so the tin shed weight instead of collecting it. He packed straw tighter along the north wall and sealed a hairline gap by the door with a strip of rubber scavenged from a conveyor belt. These were not grand improvements. They were the kind that kept mornings possible. Word continued to move. It did not gather. It passed through, leaving marks. A bundle of firewood appeared one evening, stacked neatly by the door without a note. The next day, a sack of potatoes leaned against the wall, burlap damp with melt. Gid did not announce gratitude. He added what arrived to the ledger he kept in his head and balanced it with work wherever he could find it. The town, in turn, stopped asking what he planned to do and started asking when he could come look. One afternoon brought a job that tested more than his hands. A man named Carl Jensen arrived just before dusk, his truck idling too loud in the cold. Carl was in his mid-50s, broad and heavy through the chest, with a beard grown thick and uneven, as if he had stopped trimming it after his wife died 2 winters earlier. His eyes were pale and guarded, and he spoke with the bluntness of someone who had learned to keep things simple because complicated hurt. My barn door's jammed, Carl said. Snow loads. I've pried it twice, keeps sticking. Gid went with him. The barn sat low against a tree line, wind scouring the open side. Gid examined the hinge, the frame, the warp in the wood. He didn't rush. He adjusted the latch, squared the door with shims cut from scrap, planed the edge until it swung clean. Carl watched in silence, arms crossed, breath steaming. When the door closed without complaint, Carl nodded once. But he reached into his pocket and held out more cash than Gid had asked for. Gid hesitated, then took it. Carl's mouth tightened, not displeasure, but something like relief. You work like you mean it, he said. Most folks don't. Back at the cabin, Gid added the money to his envelope and noticed how little the number mattered now compared to the steadiness it represented. He fed Rook and sat for a moment, listening to the wind test and move on. Responsibility had a weight to it, but it also had shape. You could brace against it. The night that changed the shape of things arrived without warning. A system rolled in off the lake fast and hard, collapsing visibility and swallowing sound. Gid had just banked the fire when Rook rose sharply, ears forward, a low sound in his throat that Gid had learned to trust. But he grabbed the lantern and stepped outside. The wind hit like a shove. Shapes emerged and vanished. Gid lifted the lantern higher and saw a man stagger into the light, then drop to one knee. Another figure stumbled behind him, smaller, wrapped tight. Gid moved forward, boots sinking, the lantern carving a narrow tunnel through white. Here, he called, voice cutting through the wind. The man was in his early 30s, tall and thin, face hollowed by cold and fear. His beard was short and dark, rimed with ice. He wore a canvas jacket soaked through, the fabric stiffening as it froze. The smaller figure was a woman, older than him, her movements careful, deliberate. Her name would be Ada Klein. She was 68, bones light and stubborn, hair tucked under a scarf she had knitted herself years before arthritis slowed her hands. She leaned on a cane that had become useless in the snow. The road vanished, the man said. We followed the light. Gid didn't ask questions. He guided them inside, set Ada near the fire, kept the heat low and steady. He checked hands, cheeks, the back of the neck. He spoke calmly, evenly. the way he always did when panic tried to crowd out thinking. Rook took position by the door, body angled to block the worst of the draft. The man's name was Jonah Pierce. He'd grown up here, left, come back to care for Ada after a fall. He apologized too much, each word an attempt to make himself smaller than the danger that had found them. Gid interrupted him gently with instructions. Sit, drink, breathe. The storm hammered the tin roof and slid away. The cabin held. They stayed until morning. When the wind broke and the world returned in fragments, Gid helped Jonah dig a path back to the road. Ada pressed Gid's hands between her own before she left, her grip surprisingly strong. You keep that light, she said. People need it. The phrase followed him through the day. He kept working, but the idea lodged deeper, not as pride, as obligation. That night, he sat at the table he had built from salvaged planks and wrote a list, not of tasks but of limits. How many people could the cabin hold safely? How much heat he could maintain without risking the structure? What he would do if the light drew more than he could manage? The answers were not comforting, but they were honest. He tacked the list to the wall and adjusted the sign outside, adding a smaller note beneath it. Shelter, limited capacity. Maris came by the next afternoon with a stack of printed maps and a box of reflective markers. She had circles under her eyes and a steadiness in her hands that suggested she had slept poorly and decided to be useful anyway. Marking the spur, she said. If people know where to turn, fewer will wander. Gid helped her place the markers, the bright tape catching light even in the gray. They worked in companionable silence. When they finished, Maris looked at the cabin, the lantern, the sign. You're carrying a lot, she said, not as a warning, but as recognition. Gid nodded. I can carry it. Rook watched them from the doorway, tail moving once, measured. The last visitor of the week arrived at dusk in a city truck with the emblem half scraped by salt. Dean Hollis stepped out, shoulders hunched against the cold. He didn't smile, and he didn't frown. He took in the markers, the sign, the lantern. Council's talking again, he said. Some want rules, some want credit. I told them neither will keep people alive. He met Gid's eyes. They're calling it a refuge now. Gid considered the word. It felt heavier than shelter, less temporary. I didn't name it, he said. Dean nodded. Good. He hesitated. If it gets too much, I'll say so, Gid said. Dean tipped his cap and left. That night the wind softened. Snow fell light and patient. Gid lit the lantern and sat with Rook by the door, listening to the cabin breathe. He thought about the line he had drawn weeks ago, what he would hold. He had not crossed it, he had widened it. Staying, he realized, was not passive. It was a series of choices made daily, in weather and in quiet, with limits acknowledged and work done anyway. He stayed because leaving would have been easier. He stayed because the light mattered. He stayed. February did not end winter. It negotiated with it. The light lingered a few minutes longer each evening, and the cold loosened its grip just enough to remind Gideon Mercer that seasons, like people, could change without announcing it. The cabin stood through the shift with a quiet confidence it had earned. The tin roof held. The seams stayed tight. The straw under the floor did its work. When the wind came, the structure answered with familiar creaks instead of alarms. Gid learned those sounds the way sailors learned water, by listening until fear gave way to knowledge. The refuge no longer felt improvised. It was still rough, still plainly assembled from what the town could spare, but it had become coherent. A bench built from planed planks ran along the south wall. Hooks held coats and gloves in a deliberate order. A small ledger hung by the door. Not names, just dates and tallies of nights the light had been followed. Gid kept the count because it mattered to him to know the measure of what he was carrying. Work found him with regularity now. Repairs that once would have been put off were brought to him early, before snow could make small problems dangerous. He never advertised. He never bargained. People paid what they could, when they could. He accepted with the same evenness he had learned in uniform, and the town learned to trust that he would show up and finish. Rook changed too. The dog's movements softened, less sharp at the edges without losing purpose. He took to the bench by the door during storms, a sentinel by choice. Children who passed learned to greet him with space and respect. Rook acknowledged them with a stillness that felt like permission. He had found a job that did not end. The final storm of the season came on a Sunday night, sudden and wet, the kind that carried weight. Gid cleared the roof twice before midnight, then banked the fire and set the lantern. The wind rose and fell, testing, retreating, trying again. He stayed awake until the sounds settled into patterns he recognized. When he slept, it was light but unbroken. Morning brought a knock, not frantic, not lost, deliberate. Gid opened the door to find Dean Hollis and Paula Reyes standing side by side, boots dusted with snow, breath fogging the air. Dean's face held a rare seriousness. Paula's expression was composed, professional, but there was a different quality to it now, less distance. "We're not here to shut you down," Paula said before Gid could speak. "We're here to make something official." They stepped inside and sat at the table Gid had built. Paula laid out paperwork in neat stacks. Dean leaned back, arms crossed, watching Gid's reactions the way he watched storms, without flinching. "Seasonal designation," Paula said. "Volunteer refuge, limited capacity, city-supported maintenance when weather crosses certain thresholds." She looked at Gid. "You'd keep authority over the space. We'd keep liability clear." Gid listened. He asked questions that mattered, about autonomy, about safety, about what happened if he needed to say no. Paula answered directly. Dean nodded when it counted. "I won't run it like a facility," Gid said. Paula didn't argue. "We weren't asking." They signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When it was done, Dean stood and extended a hand. Gid took it. Outside, the sun found a break in the clouds and touched the tin roof. Snow slid and fell away in clean sheets. The cabin looked the same as it had yesterday. That mattered too. By late afternoon, the town began to arrive, not all at once, not as a crowd. Warren Pike came first, carrying a crate of windows wrapped in old blankets. He set them down and stood there, hands in his pockets, beard rimed with cold. "Used, but good," he said. "Figured you'd make them fit." "I will," Gid said. Maris Crowley followed with a small box and a careful smile. Inside were laminated maps, updated routes marked in red, and a clipboard with a simple rotation for storm checks. "I talked to the library board," she said. "They're fine with this being connected." Ruth Calder arrived with Jasper, the horse blowing softly into the cold, patience embodied. She unloaded a bale of straw and a sack of oats without comment. Tom Halverson nodded from the bed of his truck, corrugated tin clanging once in agreement with itself. Ellen Price dropped off a pot of stew and didn't wait to be thanked. Even Carl Jensen came by, hat in hand, beard tidied. He didn't linger. He left a stack of split wood and a note that said only, "For the nights it gets heavy." Gid watched the day unfold without stepping into the center of it. He moved where needed, accepted help where it was offered, declined what he couldn't manage. Rook stayed close, the dog's presence anchoring the room. As dusk approached, a family arrived, the same trio from early winter, while Caleb and Lila with Mara bundled between them. Mara's cheeks were rounder now, her eyes bright. She waved at the lantern as if greeting an old friend. Caleb handed Gid a folded newspaper. "Local veteran turns decommissioned cabin into winter refuge," the headline read. Gid felt heat rise in his face and folded the paper away. "I didn't," he said. "You did," Lila replied gently. "You kept the door open." They stayed for soup and left before dark, hugs exchanged like promises. When night came, the lantern went on as it always had. The sign by the door read what it had read for weeks, now backed by paper and policy. Light on, shelter when needed. Below it, the smaller note still held limited capacity. Gid kept both. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It crept in. Snow softened, then retreated. Drips sounded from the eaves at midday. The ground gave a little underfoot. Gid replaced the last temporary brace with a proper beam and set the windows Warren had brought, marveling at how the world looked through glass instead of open air. The cabin breathed easier. So did he. On the first evening, the temperature stayed above freezing. Gid stood outside and watched the sky fade into layered blues. The lantern glowed behind him, steady and warm. A passerby on the track tipped his hat. Gid nodded back. Rook sat at his heel, tail resting on the snowless ground. The dog's eyes followed the light and then the dark content. Gid thought of the night he had read a crooked flyer under an awning and decided to stay. He had not known what staying would ask of him. He only knew that leaving would have been easier. The house had answered that choice. He and the town had answered the house. He turned the lantern down, not off, never off. He went inside, closed the door, and listened to the cabin settle into itself, a structure no longer arguing with the weather, a place that knew what it was for. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in thunder or light. Sometimes He sends them quietly, through a single decision not to give up, a small light left on in the dark, or a heart that chooses to stay when walking away would be easier. This story isn't really about a cabin, or a storm, or even survival. It's about how God works through ordinary people who refuse to close their doors, even when they themselves are broken, tired, or forgotten. In our daily lives, we all face moments like that $10 cabin. Something dismissed, something damaged, something everyone else walks past. And yet, when we choose patience over fear, compassion over comfort, and faith over doubt, God turns those small choices into quiet miracles. If this story touched you, maybe it's because someone out there is waiting for your light, a word, a gesture, a hand held out instead of pulled away. Please take a moment to share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you believe that no child, no animal, and no soul should ever face fear alone, subscribe to the channel so these stories can reach more hearts. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in the storms you cannot see yet. And may the light you carry guide someone safely home tonight.